In the heart of London, where centuries-old traditions meet modern-day chaos, stands Buckingham Palace. Every day, millions of tourists snap photos of the iconic red-coated guards who stand motionless, protecting the crown. Most people respect these elite soldiers. But what happens when someone doesn't? What happens when arrogance meets honor, when disrespect collides with duty, and when a single punch changes everything? This is the true story of Marcus Thompson, a man whose life took a devastating turn in just 3 seconds. A story that reminds us that some lines should never be crossed, and some people should never be underestimated. Because sometimes the consequences of our actions come faster and harder than we ever imagined. The Royal Guards aren't just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms. They're highly trained soldiers with combat experience. And on one fateful Tuesday morning, Marcus Thompson was about to learn this lesson the hardest way possible. Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of man who believed rules were for other people. At 32 years old, he had built his reputation on being the loudest voice in any room, the guy who never backed down from a confrontation, and someone who thrived on making others uncomfortable. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and hands that had seen their share of bar fights, Marcus carried himself like a man who had never met his match. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East London, Marcus had learned early that respect came through fear, and fear came through force. His childhood was a series of playground dominance and teenage street fights that had earned him a reputation as someone you didn't mess with. By his 20s, this attitude had translated into a string of jobs he couldn't keep, relationships that ended badly, and a growing list of people who actively avoided him. But Marcus didn't see it that way. In his mind, he was just being real in a world full of fake people. He was the guy who said what everyone else was thinking, but was too scared to say. He was the one who stood up to authority when others cowered. At least, that's the story he told himself every morning when he looked in a mirror. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was nursing a hangover and a bruised ego. The night before, he had been thrown out of his local pub for starting a fight with a man who had accidentally bumped into him. The bouncer, a former boxer named Jimmy, had physically removed Marcus from the premises while a crowd of regular customers cheered. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid, and he spent the entire night plotting ways to restore his damaged reputation. Marcus lived in a cramped studio apartment above a fish and chips shop where the smell of grease and vinegar had permanently soaked into everything he owned. His unemployment benefits barely covered the rent, and his last job at a construction site had ended 3 weeks ago when he had gotten into a shouting match with his supervisor. The supervisor had called him unreliable and aggressive, 2 words that Marcus had heard too many times in his life. As he stumbled out of bed that morning, Marcus caught sight of himself in the cracked mirror hanging on his wall. His brown hair was disheveled, his face was puffy from drinking, and his clothes from the night before were wrinkled and stained. But what bothered him most was the look in his own eyes. For just a moment, he saw something that looked like doubt, like maybe all those people who had called him a failure weren't entirely wrong. That moment of self-awareness lasted exactly 3 seconds before Marcus pushed it away. He wasn't a problem. Everyone else was. Society was full of weak people who couldn't handle someone with a backbone. His ex-girlfriend Sarah had told him that his anger was destroying his life. But what did she know? She had left him for some accountant who probably had never thrown a punch in his life. Marcus grabbed his jacket, a worn leather thing that had seen better days, and headed out into the London morning. The city was already alive with the usual chaos of commuters rushing to work, tourists consulting maps, and street vendors setting up their stalls. The noise and energy of London usually made Marcus feel powerful, like he was part of something bigger than himself. But today it just made his headache worse. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, his mind still replaying the humiliation from the night before. Every person who walked past him seemed to be living a life that made sense, heading somewhere with purpose, while Marcus felt like he was stuck in some kind of endless loop of disappointment and rage. It was around 11 in the morning when Marcus found himself standing outside Buckingham Palace. He had no particular reason for being there. His feet had just carried him in that direction while his mind wandered. The palace stood magnificent and imposing, its facade speaking of centuries of power and tradition. Tourists clustered around the gates with cameras and guidebooks, all hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty or at least get the perfect photo to post online. Marcus watched the scene with growing irritation. All these people from all over the world coming to gawk at what he saw as an outdated symbol of privilege and inequality. The palace represented everything that was wrong with the world, in his opinion. Here was this massive, expensive building where people lived in luxury, while guys like him struggled to pay rent on a tiny apartment above a chip shop. But what really caught his attention were the guards. 2 royal guards stood at their posts, resplendent in their traditional red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. They stood perfectly still, their rifles held at their sides, their faces expressionless beneath the shadow of their ceremonial headwear. To most observers, they looked like living statues, part of the pageantry and tradition that made Buckingham Palace such a popular tourist destination. Marcus had seen royal guards before, of course. Everyone who lived in London had. But today, for some reason, their stillness irritated him. Their discipline seemed like a personal challenge, their composure a form of arrogance. Here were 2 guys, probably around his own age, who thought they were better than everyone else just because they wore fancy uniforms and got to carry rifles. The guard on the left was slightly taller than his companion, with a stance that spoke of military training and physical conditioning. Even though his face was largely hidden beneath his bearskin hat, there was something about his posture that suggested alertness and readiness. This was Guardsman James Mitchell, though Marcus had no way of knowing his name. James Mitchell was 28 years old and had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duty at the palace. Unlike Marcus, James had found purpose and direction through military service. The discipline that irritated Marcus so much was actually a source of pride and stability for James. Standing guard duty required intense concentration, physical endurance, and mental toughness. It wasn't the easy job that tourists imagined, but Marcus saw none of this complexity. To him, the guards were just another symbol of authority that needed to be challenged, another example of people who thought they were special because of their uniforms and their positions. His hangover was making him more irritable than usual, and the memory of last night's humiliation was still fresh in his mind. As Marcus stood there watching, a group of American tourists approached the guards, chattering excitedly about getting photos with the toy soldiers. One elderly woman from Texas actually reached out to touch James's uniform, apparently thinking he was some kind of mannequin. James executed a perfect drill movement, stepping back and bringing his rifle to the ready position while barking out the traditional warning. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." James's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. The tourists jumped back, startled and embarrassed. The elderly woman's face turned red, and her husband began apologizing profusely. Within seconds, they had retreated to what they assumed was a safe distance, their excitement replaced by nervous laughter and whispered conversations about how realistic the guards were. Marcus watched this interaction with growing resentment. In his mind, James had just humiliated innocent tourists who were simply trying to enjoy their vacation. He saw it as an abuse of power, a perfect example of someone in uniform throwing their weight around just because they could. The fact that James was actually doing his job, protecting both the palace and the tourists themselves from potentially dangerous situations, didn't occur to Marcus. What Marcus failed to understand was that the Royal Guard's stillness was not arrogance, but professionalism. Their discipline was not about feeling superior, but about maintaining the security and dignity of one of the world's most important historical sites. These were active duty soldiers who had earned their positions through rigorous training and service, not ceremonial actors playing dress-up for tourists. But Marcus's worldview didn't allow for such nuance. In his experience, people in positions of authority were either corrupt, incompetent, or both. The idea that someone might earn respect through dedication and service was foreign to him. In Marcus's mind, respect was something you took by force, not something you earned through discipline and duty. As the morning wore on, more tourists came and went, and Marcus found himself fixated on the guards. He studied their movements, looking for signs of weakness or humanity that would confirm his belief that they were just regular guys putting on an act. But James and his partner maintained their professional demeanor hour after hour, barely seeming to breathe, let alone show fatigue or irritation. This only made Marcus angrier. Everyone had a breaking point, and he was determined to find theirs. In his twisted logic, exposing the guards as frauds would somehow vindicate his own failures and prove that authority figures were no better than he was. It would be his revenge against a world that had consistently rejected and humiliated him. The irony was lost on Marcus that he was planning to humiliate others because he felt humiliated himself. The cycle of anger and resentment that had defined his entire adult life was about to claim another victim. But this time, that victim would be himself. As the clock approached noon, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He was going to test these guards, push them until they broke, and show everyone watching that they were just as flawed and human as everyone else. What he didn't know was that he was about to discover that some people truly are different, and that the line between courage and foolishness is often much thinner than we imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be over in seconds, but remembered for years. Marcus Thompson, a man who had spent his entire life looking for a fight he could win, was about to find one that would cost him more than he ever imagined possible. The first test was small, almost innocent. Marcus walked closer to the guards, positioning himself just outside the rope barrier that kept tourists at a respectful distance. He stared directly at James, trying to make eye contact through the shadow cast by the bearskin hat. For several minutes, Marcus stood there, willing the guard to acknowledge his presence, to show some reaction to being stared at by a hostile stranger. James, however, had dealt with far worse than an angry man tried to stare him down. During his time in Afghanistan, he had maintained composure while under actual enemy fire. A disgruntled tourist with bloodshot eyes and yesterday's clothes was hardly a threat worth acknowledging. James kept his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his breathing steady, his posture perfect. Other tourists began to notice Marcus's behavior. A family from Japan moved away from him, the parents instinctively pulling their children to a safer distance. An elderly British couple shot disapproving looks in his direction, and the woman whispered something to her husband about troublemakers and lack of respect. But Marcus was too focused on his target to notice the growing discomfort of those around him. After 10 minutes of fruitless staring, Marcus decided to escalate. He began making comments, loud enough for everyone to hear, but carefully worded to avoid obvious threats. "Look at this guy," Marcus said to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Standing there like he's something special. But he's never done a real day's work in his life." A middle-aged man in a business suit turned to look at Marcus with obvious distaste. "Show some respect," the man said quietly. "These are soldiers who serve our country." Marcus rounded on the businessman with the fury of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of confrontation. "Serve our country? By standing around in costume, playing dress-up? My uncle served in the real army, in real wars. These guys are just tourist attractions." What Marcus didn't know was that James had served 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, had been decorated for valor under fire, and had seen more real military action than Marcus could even imagine. The irony of calling a combat veteran a tourist attraction while standing outside one of the most heavily secured buildings in London was lost on Marcus entirely. The businessman shook his head in disgust and walked away, clearly not wanting to engage with someone who was so obviously looking for a fight. This retreat felt like a victory to Marcus, confirmation that he was right, and everyone else was just too weak to admit it. Emboldened by this small triumph, Marcus stepped closer to the rope barrier. Now he was only about 10 feet from James, close enough to see the detailed craftsmanship of the guard's uniform, the perfect polish on his boots, the absolute stillness of his breathing. Up close, it became even more obvious that this wasn't just some ceremonial actor, but a highly trained soldier. But Marcus interpreted what he saw differently. To him, the guard's perfection was just another form of arrogance, a way of showing off and making regular people feel inferior. The fact that James maintained his composure despite Marcus's obvious hostility only made Marcus angrier. "I'm talking to you," Marcus said, his voice now loud enough to draw attention from tourists 50 yards away. "You think you're too good to acknowledge when someone's speaking to you?" James had been trained for this exact situation. Dealing with hostile or disruptive tourists was part of the job, and the protocol was clear. Maintain composure, avoid engagement, and only respond if there was a direct threat to security. Verbal harassment from a distance didn't qualify as such a threat, so James continued to stand at attention, giving no sign that he had heard Marcus at all. This non-response drove Marcus into a fury. In his world, being ignored was the ultimate insult, worse than being cursed at or threatened. When someone ignored Marcus, it meant they thought he was beneath their notice, unworthy of even basic acknowledgement. It was the same feeling he had experienced when his father had ignored his questions as a child, when teachers had dismissed his disruptions in class, when employers had stopped responding to his job applications. "Too good to even look at me." Marcus's voice was getting louder and more aggressive. "We'll see about that." By now, a small crowd had gathered to watch the confrontation. Most were tourists who had no idea what they were witnessing, but some were locals who recognized the signs of trouble brewing. A few people had already started moving away, not wanting to be caught up in whatever was about to happen. Among the crowd was Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who happened to be walking through the area during her lunch break. Sarah was a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police who had seen enough trouble in her career to recognize it from a distance. She watched Marcus's behavior with the trained eye of someone who knew how quickly situations like this could escalate from verbal harassment to physical violence. Sarah considered intervening, but held back for the moment. The Royal Guards were more than capable of handling themselves, and uniformed police officers were stationed nearby if needed. She decided to observe and be ready to act if the situation deteriorated further. Meanwhile, Marcus was working himself into an even greater rage. The guard's continued silence felt like a personal attack on his very existence. In his mind, he was being disrespected by someone who was no better than he was, maybe even worse. After all, what kind of man spent his days standing motionless while tourists took pictures? "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Marcus shouted, his voice now echoing off the palace walls. Several tourists turned to stare, and some began moving their children away from the scene. The atmosphere around the palace entrance, usually filled with excitement and wonder, had turned tense and uncomfortable. James remained perfectly still, but those who knew what to look for could see subtle signs of increased alertness. His grip on his rifle had shifted almost imperceptibly, and his weight had redistributed in a way that would allow for quicker movement if necessary. These weren't conscious decisions, but automatic responses drilled into him through years of military training. Marcus misread these subtle changes as signs of fear or uncertainty. In his mind, he was finally getting under the guard's skin, finally proving that the man was human after all. This perceived victory only encouraged him to push harder. "What's wrong, scared?" Marcus taunted. "Afraid to face a real man without your fancy uniform and your big gun?" This comment revealed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of both the situation and the person he was confronting. James had faced actual combat situations where real enemies with real weapons had tried to kill him. A belligerent drunk in London posed no threat that James hadn't dealt with before in circumstances far more dangerous than anything Marcus could imagine. But Marcus was beyond rational thought now. The combination of his hangover, his humiliation from the previous night, and his lifelong resentment of authority had created a perfect storm of rage and poor judgment. He was operating purely on emotion, driven by a desperate need to prove himself superior to someone, anyone. The crowd continued to grow, and several people had started filming with their phones. In the age of social media, Any public confrontation was likely to be recorded and shared online within minutes. This added another layer of complexity to the situation, as Marcus was now performing for an audience, making it even less likely that he would back down gracefully. Detective Inspector Collins noticed the phones and made a mental note to collect any footage as evidence if this situation required police intervention. She had seen too many cases where social media had turned minor incidents into major news stories, usually to everyone's detriment. Marcus took another step forward, now right at the edge of the rope barrier. Protocol dictated that James should issue a warning if anyone crossed that line, and Marcus seemed intent on testing whether the guard would actually do it. "Come on then," Marcus said, his voice dripping with challenge and contempt. "Say something. Do something. Or are you just going to stand there like a statue your whole life?" What Marcus didn't understand was that standing like a statue required enormous discipline and training. It wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. The ability to maintain composure under pressure, to resist provocation, to stay focused on duty despite distractions. These were all qualities that Marcus had never developed in his own life. James had undergone months of specialized training just for this role. He had learned to stand perfectly still for hours at a time, to ignore distractions and harassment, to maintain focus despite fatigue, weather, and provocation. This training had built on the discipline he had already developed as a combat soldier, where the ability to stay calm under pressure could mean the difference between life and death. But Marcus saw none of this. To him, the guard's silence was just stubbornness, and his stillness was just showing off. Marcus had never experienced the kind of discipline that James displayed daily, so he couldn't recognize it or respect it. The tension in the air was becoming palpable. Even tourists who didn't understand English could sense that something was wrong. The usual cheerful chatter around the palace gates had died down to nervous whispers and worried looks. Marcus was now sweating despite the cool October air. His hands were clenched into fists, and his face was red with anger and embarrassment. He had committed himself to this confrontation in front of dozens of witnesses, and backing down now would mean another humiliating defeat to add to his growing collection. What he failed to realize was that he had already lost. By making himself the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, by displaying his anger and lack of control in public, by harassing a soldier who was simply doing his job, Marcus had revealed himself to be exactly what everyone already thought he was, a troubled man with serious problems who took out his frustrations on innocent people. But Marcus was beyond such self-awareness. He was trapped in a cycle of escalation that he couldn't break, driven by emotions he couldn't control toward a confrontation that could only end badly for him. The stage was set for the moment that would define the rest of his life, and Marcus Thompson was about to take the final step that would change everything forever. The moment Marcus crossed the rope barrier, everything changed. It was such a simple action, just one step forward on a ground that had been clearly marked as off-limits. But it triggered a cascade of consequences that would reshape his entire future in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. James's response was immediate and decisive. Years of military training kicked in as he executed a perfect drill movement, bringing his rifle to the ready position and fixing Marcus with a stare that could have frozen fire. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. 1 second, James had been a statue-like figure standing quietly at his post. The next, he was clearly a combat-ready soldier prepared to defend his position. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." James's voice boomed across the courtyard with such authority that pigeons took flight from nearby trees. The sound seemed to echo off every surface, reaching every corner of the palace grounds and beyond. The effect on the crowd was electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children who had been laughing and playing fell silent. Even the most casual observers suddenly understood that they were witnessing something serious, something that had moved beyond tourism and into the realm of genuine security. But Marcus, driven by a toxic combination of alcohol withdrawal, wounded pride, and lifelong resentment, interpreted James's professional response as a personal challenge. Instead of stepping back like any reasonable person would have done, Marcus planted his feet more firmly and raised his chin in defiance. "Oh, so now you want to talk?" Marcus sneered, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet courtyard. "What are you going to do about it, toy soldier? Shoot me for stepping on your precious ground." Detective Inspector Collins immediately began moving closer, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond verbal harassment. She spoke quietly into her radio, requesting backup and alerting other officers in the area. Her 15 years of experience told her that this was about to get much worse very quickly. What Marcus didn't understand was that James's warning wasn't a threat or an act of aggression. It was actually a courtesy. According to security protocols, James would have been fully justified in using physical force the moment Marcus crossed the barrier. Instead, he had given Marcus a chance to step back and end the confrontation peacefully. But Marcus's worldview didn't allow him to see it that way. To him, the warning was just more evidence that people in authority thought they could push regular folks around. The idea that he might actually be in the wrong, that he might be the aggressor in this situation, never occurred to him. "I'm not impressed by your little costume," Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more belligerent. "You think that uniform makes you special? You think it makes you better than me?" James maintained his professional composure, but those with military experience could see the subtle signs of a soldier preparing for action. His stance had shifted to provide better balance and mobility. His breathing had become more controlled and focused. His eyes were scanning for potential threats while maintaining primary focus on Marcus. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the commotion, but kept at a respectful distance by the obvious tension in the air. Many people were filming now, their phones capturing every word and gesture. In the age of viral videos, this confrontation was being preserved for posterity, whether the participants wanted it or not. Marcus seemed to feed off the attention. Having an audience made him feel powerful, important, like he was finally the center of the story instead of just a supporting character in everyone else's life. He had spent so many years being ignored, dismissed, and forgotten that even negative attention felt like a victory. "Look at all these people watching," Marcus said, gesturing broadly to the crowd. "They want to see what you're really made of. They want to see if you're as tough as you pretend to be." What the crowd actually wanted was for this disturbed man to leave the guard alone and stop ruining everyone's day at one of London's most famous landmarks. But Marcus projected his own desires onto them, imagining support and encouragement where there was actually disapproval and concern. James remained silent, following protocol and training. Engaging in verbal sparring with Marcus would only escalate the situation further and potentially create more problems. The guard's job was to protect the palace and maintain order, not to engage in debates with every person who felt like causing trouble. But Marcus interpreted this continued silence as weakness or fear. In his experience, people only stayed quiet when they were intimidated or uncertain. The possibility that James was actually showing restraint and professionalism was beyond Marcus's understanding. "Nothing to say now," Marcus taunted. "All that tough guy act disappeared pretty quick when someone actually stood up to you." Detective Inspector Collins had positioned herself where she could intervene quickly if necessary, but she hoped the situation might still resolve itself peacefully. Royal Guard were trained to handle these situations, and Marcus hadn't yet crossed the line into physical assault. But she could see the signs of someone working themselves up to do something really stupid. Marcus took another step forward, now standing directly in front of James at a distance of less than 3 feet. This was a clear violation of multiple security protocols and put him well within what military personnel would consider a threat perimeter. Any reasonable person would have recognized this as an extremely dangerous position to be in, but Marcus was operating on emotion rather than logic. "I'm right here," Marcus said, his voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow more menacing than when he had been shouting. "What are you going to do about it?" The crowd held its collective breath. Even people who had no military experience could sense that something significant was about to happen. The atmosphere had become so tense that it felt like the air itself was charged with electricity. James gave Marcus one more chance, speaking in a calm but unmistakable tone of authority. "Sir, you need to step back immediately." It was the voice of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat, someone who had been trained to give orders that could save lives or prevent disasters. There was no anger in it, no personal animosity, just a clear expectation of immediate compliance. But Marcus heard something entirely different. To his ears, it sounded like condescension, like someone talking down to him the way people had been doing his entire life. His teachers, his employers, his ex-girlfriend, the bouncer from last night, they had all used that same tone of voice, treating him like he was stupid or inferior. "Don't tell me what to do," Marcus snarled, poking his finger toward James's chest, but stopping just short of actual contact. "You're not my boss. You're not better than me. You're just some guy in a funny hat who thinks he's important." The finger pointing was the final straw. In military and security terms, aggressive gesturing at close range constitutes a threat that requires immediate response. James had given Marcus every opportunity to de-escalate the situation peacefully, but Marcus had chosen to continue escalating instead. What happened next would be debated by witnesses, analyzed by experts, and discussed on social media for months to come. But in the moment itself, it unfolded with the terrifying speed and precision of military training meeting civilian recklessness. Marcus, driven by a lifetime of accumulated rage and resentment, made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Seeing what he interpreted as weakness or hesitation in James's measured response, Marcus convinced himself that he had found someone he could finally intimidate, someone he could finally prove himself against. With a surge of misplaced confidence and alcohol-fueled bravado, Marcus pulled back his right fist and threw the punch that he thought would establish his dominance once and for all. In his mind, he was striking a blow for everyone who had ever been looked down on by people in authority. He was proving that fancy uniforms and ceremonial weapons didn't make someone untouchable. What Marcus didn't know was that he was attacking one of the most highly trained soldiers in the British military, someone who had survived combat situations that would have broken most people, someone whose reflexes had been honed through years of life-or-death scenarios. The punch that Marcus threw with all his strength and fury was about to meet a level of training, discipline, and control violence that he couldn't even imagine. In less than 3 seconds, Marcus Thompson's life was about to change forever, and not in the way he expected. As his fist moved through the air toward James's face, Marcus felt a moment of savage satisfaction. Finally, he was going to win a confrontation. Finally, he was going to prove that he was not someone to be ignored or dismissed. But James Mitchell had other plans. The collision between Marcus's fist and James's training was over almost before it began. What Marcus had intended as a devastating blow to assert his dominance became instead a masterclass in the difference between street aggression and military precision. James's response was not reactive but proactive. His training had taught him to read body language and anticipate attacks, so he saw Marcus's punch coming before Marcus had even fully committed to throwing it. The subtle shift in weight, the tension in the shoulders, the drawing back of the arm. These were all telegraph signals that James had been trained to recognize and counter. As Marcus's fist moved forward with all the force his anger could muster, James executed a defensive movement so smooth and efficient that witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what they had seen. In one fluid motion, James deflected the incoming punch with his left arm while simultaneously delivering a controlled but devastating counterstrike with his right elbow. The impact was precise and surgical. James's elbow connected with Marcus's jaw at exactly the right angle and with exactly the right amount of force to achieve maximum effect, while maintaining complete control. It wasn't the wild, emotion-driven violence that Marcus specialized in, but the calculated application of force by someone who understood leverage, anatomy, and the mechanics of combat. The sound of the impact echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. It was followed immediately by a softer, but somehow more disturbing sound, the distinct crack of teeth breaking under pressure. Marcus's aggressive advance stopped instantly, replaced by a stumbling backward motion as his body tried to process what had just happened to it. For a moment, Marcus remained upright, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. The pain hadn't fully registered yet, blocked temporarily by adrenaline and disbelief. He touched his mouth tentatively, and his fingers came away covered in blood and fragments of what had once been his front teeth. The crowd gasped collectively as they witnessed the sudden and dramatic end to the confrontation. Many people instinctively covered their mouths with their hands, as if sympathetically feeling the damage that had been inflicted on Marcus. The phones that had been recording the build-up to the violence now captured its swift and brutal conclusion. Detective Inspector Collins was moving before Marcus hit the ground, speaking rapidly into her radio to request immediate medical assistance. Despite her disapproval of Marcus's behavior, she was a police officer first, and ensuring the safety of all parties was her primary concern. Marcus finally collapsed to his knees, blood streaming from his mouth and pooling on the ancient stones of the palace courtyard. He was making gurgling sounds as he tried to breathe through the blood and dental fragments that filled his mouth. The reality of what had happened was beginning to penetrate his shock, and with it came pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. James had immediately returned to his position at attention, his rifle back at his side, his expression once again professionally neutral. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 5 seconds from first contact to final conclusion, and James gave no outward sign that anything unusual had occurred. This return to composure was almost as shocking to witnesses as the violence itself had been. The crowd was buzzing with excited and horrified conversation. Tourists who had come to London for a peaceful sightseeing experience found themselves witnesses to a dramatic confrontation that would dominate their vacation stories for years to come. Many were still filming, capturing Marcus's agonized attempts to collect his scattered teeth from the blood-stained pavement. "Oh my God, did you see that?" An American tourist whispered to her husband. "It was like something out of a movie. That guard barely moved, and the guy just collapsed." A businessman who had witnessed the entire encounter from the beginning was already on his phone, describing the scene to someone in his office. "The idiot actually threw a punch at a royal guard. I've never seen anyone move that fast." It was over before it started. Marcus was now fully experiencing the consequences of his actions. The pain in his jaw was excruciating, made worse by the realization that several of his teeth were either broken or completely missing. He could taste blood and feel sharp fragments cutting the inside of his mouth with every movement of his tongue. The humiliation was almost as severe as the physical trauma. This was not how the confrontation was supposed to have gone. In Marcus's imagination, he was supposed to have proven himself superior to the guard, demonstrated his toughness, and earned the respect of the watching crowd. Instead, he was on his knees in a pool of his own blood while tourists took pictures of his defeat. Detective Inspector Collins reached Marcus and immediately began administering first aid while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. Despite her years of experience with violent criminals and their victims, she was struck by the precision of what she had witnessed. This wasn't the kind of messy, prolonged fight she usually dealt with, but a single, controlled response that had ended the threat immediately and definitively. "Sir, try not to move," she instructed Marcus as he continued to fumble around looking for his teeth. "Medical assistance is on the way. Just stay calm and try to control your breathing." Marcus tried to speak, but could only produce a wet, garbled sound through his damaged mouth. The words he wanted to say, accusations, complaints, demand for justice, were literally impossible to articulate. The irony that his own aggression had silenced him was not lost on the more observant members of the crowd. Meanwhile, James continued his duty as if nothing had happened. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and protocol required him to return to normal operations as quickly as possible after any security incident. The fact that he showed no signs of stress or emotion after what he had just done was a testament to his military conditioning and mental discipline. Other security personnel had arrived on the scene and were beginning to establish a perimeter around Marcus while collecting witness statements. The incident would need to be thoroughly documented and investigated, despite the clear-cut nature of what had occurred. Several tourists volunteered their phone footage as evidence, eager to be part of the official record of such an unusual event. One of the security officers approached James and spoke quietly with him for a moment. James nodded curtly, but remained at his post. According to protocol, he would be relieved of duty shortly for debriefing and to ensure he hadn't been injured in the altercation, but until his replacement arrived, he would continue to perform his assigned role. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its sirens adding to the chaos that had replaced the normally peaceful atmosphere around the palace. Paramedics quickly assessed Marcus's condition and began preparing him for transport to the hospital. His injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, though the damage to his teeth would require extensive dental surgery to repair. As Marcus was loaded onto a stretcher, still conscious but heavily medicated for pain, he caught sight of James standing perfectly at attention as if nothing had happened. The guard's composure and professionalism in the aftermath of violence was perhaps more intimidating than the violence itself had been. It spoke of someone for whom such encounters were routine, manageable, and ultimately insignificant. The crowd began to disperse as the excitement died down, but many lingered to discuss what they had witnessed. The consensus was unanimous. Marcus had gotten exactly what he deserved for attacking a soldier who was simply doing his job. The fact that the guard had shown such restraint and precision in his response only reinforced the public's respect for the royal guards and their training. Social media was already lighting up with footage of the incident. Within an hour, videos of Marcus's humiliating defeat would be viewed by millions of people around the world. The hashtags #RoyalGuard and #InstantJustice began trending as people shared and commented on the dramatic confrontation. Marcus Thompson had gotten his moment of fame, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of proving his toughness and earning respect, he had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of picking fights with people whose training and capabilities you don't understand. As the ambulance pulled away from Buckingham Palace, carrying Marcus toward a future filled with dental bills, legal consequences, and viral internet infamy, James Mitchell continued his duty. The incident that had changed Marcus's life forever was, for James, just another day at work protecting the crown and maintaining the dignity of one of Britain's most important institutions. The palace courtyard slowly returned to normal as tourists resumed their sightseeing and photo-taking. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the memory would linger long after their London vacations ended. They had seen what happened when misplaced aggression met professional discipline, and the lesson was not one they would soon forget. The hospital room where Marcus Thompson lay recovering was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, where his life had changed forever just 6 hours earlier. The sterile white walls and beeping medical equipment provided a sobering backdrop for his reflection on the catastrophic consequences of his actions. Marcus's face was a mess of swelling and bandages. The oral surgeon had worked for 3 hours to repair the damage to his mouth, but the prognosis was grim. 2 of his front teeth had been completely destroyed and would need to be replaced with expensive implants. 3 others had been severely cracked and would require extensive restoration work. The total cost of the dental work alone would be well beyond what his unemployment benefits could cover. But the physical damage was only the beginning of Marcus's problems. Detective Inspector Collins had visited him earlier to explain the charges he would be facing. Assault on a member of the armed forces was a serious offense that carried significant penalties. Additionally, he would be charged with breach of the peace, threatening behavior, and violation of security protocols at a protected government facility. The legal implications were staggering. Marcus was looking at potential jail time, substantial fines, and a permanent criminal record that would make finding employment even more difficult than it already was. His court-appointed solicitor had been blunt about his chances. With dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings of the incident, there was no question about his guilt. The only question was how severe his punishment would be. Social media had turned Marcus into an unwilling internet celebrity overnight. The videos of his confrontation with James had been viewed millions of times across various platforms, spawning countless memes, reaction videos, and commentary pieces. Most of the online discussion was not sympathetic to Marcus's plight. Comments ranged from mockery to outrage, with many people expressing satisfaction that Marcus had received what they saw as appropriate consequences for his actions. The hashtag Toothless in London had begun trending, accompanied by photos and jokes about Marcus's dental misfortune. His name, age, and background had been quickly uncovered by internet detectives, adding another layer of humiliation to his ordeal. The worst part for Marcus was reading the accurate assessments of his character that strangers on the internet had made based solely on the footage of his behavior. Comments described him as a pathetic bully, a middle-aged loser taking out his failures on others, and exactly the kind of person who ruins things for everyone else. These descriptions stung because they contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. Marcus's few remaining relationships had also suffered immediate consequences. His ex-girlfriend Sarah had called him after seeing the news coverage, not to offer support, but to express her relief that she had ended their relationship when she did. "I always knew your anger would destroy you eventually," she had said. "I just didn't think it would be this spectacular." His elderly mother had also contacted him, primarily to express her shame and disappointment. As a retired teacher who had spent her career trying to instill respect and discipline in young people, she was mortified that her son had become famous for attacking a soldier and losing his teeth in the process. Their conversation had been brief and painful, ending with her request that he not contact her again until he had sorted himself out properly. The broader implications of Marcus's actions were becoming clear as he lay in his hospital bed with nothing to do but think. His unemployment benefits would likely be suspended due to his criminal charges. His small apartment would become unaffordable without any income, especially with the massive legal and medical bills he was now facing. His already limited employment prospects had become virtually non-existent now that any potential employer could easily find videos of his violent behavior with a simple internet search. Meanwhile, James Mitchell had returned to duty the following day after completing the required debriefing and medical evaluation. The incident had been reviewed by his superiors and found to be a textbook example of appropriate use of force in response to an unprovoked attack. James had acted with exactly the right level of restraint and precision, neutralizing the threat without causing unnecessary harm. The media coverage of the incident had been overwhelmingly positive toward James and the Royal Guards in general. Military experts interviewed on television praised the professionalism and skill displayed in the encounter, noting that James's response demonstrated the high quality of training that Royal Guards received. Several former military personnel wrote opinion pieces about the importance of respecting those who serve and protecting important national institutions. James himself had declined all interview requests, maintaining the dignified silence that was characteristic of the Royal Guards. His commanding officers had commended him for his handling of both the initial incident and the subsequent media attention. The entire episode had actually enhanced the reputation of the Royal Guards rather than damaging it. For James, the incident with Marcus had been significant mainly because of the administrative paperwork it generated rather than any lasting emotional or physical impact. His military experience had taught him to compartmentalize such encounters and move on quickly. Marcus was simply another troubled individual who had made poor choices and suffered predictable consequences. The tourist industry around Buckingham Palace had actually benefited from the incident, with visitor numbers increasing as people hoped to witness similar drama or at least see the famous guard who had defended himself so effectively. Tour guides had begun incorporating the story into their presentations, using it as an example of why the Royal Guards deserved respect rather than harassment. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus received a summons for his court appearance. His solicitor had advised him to plead guilty and hope for leniency, explaining that fighting the charges would only result in more severe penalties and legal costs he couldn't afford. The evidence against him was overwhelming and indisputable. The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious members of the public when Marcus appeared for sentencing. His appearance had improved somewhat since his hospital stay, but the gaps where his teeth had been were still visible when he spoke. He had lost weight and developed a pronounced slump in his posture, looking older and more defeated than his 32 years. The judge, Honorable Margaret Whitfield, had reviewed the case thoroughly and was clearly unimpressed with Marcus's actions. In her sentencing remarks, she noted that his behavior had been a disgraceful display of aggression toward a member of our armed forces who was performing his duty with distinction. Marcus was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, meaning he would avoid jail time as long as he committed no further offenses during that period. He was also ordered to pay substantial fines, perform 200 hours of community service, and attend anger management counseling. Additionally, he was banned from entering the area around Buckingham Palace for 5 years. The financial implications of his sentence were devastating for someone in Marcus's position. The fines alone would take years to pay off, and his criminal record would make finding employment extremely difficult. The community service requirement would consume his time that could otherwise be spent job hunting, creating a vicious cycle that would be hard to escape. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus was required to attend psychological counseling to address the anger and aggression issues that had led to his assault on James. For the first time in his adult life, he would be forced to confront the patterns of behavior that had consistently sabotaged his relationships and opportunities. The counseling sessions were initially as unpleasant as Marcus had expected them to be. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, his assigned therapist, was a middle-aged woman with extensive experience treating individuals with anger management problems. She was patient but direct, refusing to accept Marcus's attempts to blame others for his situation. "You attacked a soldier who was doing his job," Dr. Harper reminded him during one session. "That wasn't society's fault, or your ex-girlfriend's fault, or your father's fault. That was your choice, and you need to accept responsibility for the consequences." Slowly, over the course of months, Marcus began to understand the destructive patterns that had controlled his life. His tendency to interpret everything as a personal slight, his inability to walk away from confrontations, his desperate need to prove himself superior to others. These were all symptoms of deeper insecurities and unresolved psychological issues. The process was painful and often humiliating, but it was also the first time Marcus had ever seriously examined his own behavior and its impact on others. He began to recognize that his aggression was actually a sign of weakness rather than strength, a way of avoiding the harder work of building genuine self-respect and meaningful relationships. A year after the incident, Marcus was working part-time at a warehouse, the only job he could find with his criminal record and internet infamy. The work was physically demanding and poorly paid, but it was honest employment that allowed him to slowly chip away at his debts and fines. His colleagues knew about his background, but had learned to respect his work ethic and his efforts to change. Marcus had also begun volunteering at a local community center, working with at-risk youth as part of his community service requirement. Ironically, his experience as someone who had made catastrophic choices made him effective at reaching young people who were heading down similar paths. His missing teeth and scarred face served as a visual reminder of where anger and poor decisions could lead. The viral videos of his confrontation with James continued to circulate online, ensuring that his moment of shame would never be completely forgotten. But Marcus had learned to accept this as part of the consequences of his actions. Dr. Harper had taught him that true strength came from owning his mistakes rather than running from them. James Mitchell, meanwhile, continued his distinguished military career. The incident with Marcus had become just one of many stories in his service record, notable mainly for the professional manner in which he had handled it. He had been promoted twice since then, and was being considered for advanced training assignments. The contrast between the two men's trajectories in the aftermath of their brief encounter was stark. James had continued to build on his foundation of discipline, service, and self-control, while Marcus had been forced to confront the bankruptcy of his previous approach to life and start rebuilding from the ground up. 5 years after the incident, Marcus Thompson was a fundamentally different person than the angry, aggressive man who had attacked a royal guard outside Buckingham Palace. His transformation had been slow, difficult, and incomplete, but it was real. He had learned the hard way that respect couldn't be taken by force, that true strength came from discipline rather than aggression, and that the only person responsible for his life was himself. The lesson of Marcus Thompson's story extended far beyond one man's personal journey. It served as a reminder that actions have consequences, that some lines should never be crossed, and that the difference between civilization and chaos often comes down to individuals like James Mitchell who stand ready to defend both with quiet professionalism and precise force when necessary. In the end, Marcus had gotten exactly what he had asked for when he threw that punch outside Buckingham Palace. He had tested himself against someone he thought he could intimidate and discovered instead what real strength looked like. The education had cost him his teeth, his reputation, and nearly everything else he valued, but it had also given him the chance to become a better person than he had ever been before. Whether he would ultimately succeed in that transformation remained to be seen, but for the first time in his life, Marcus Thompson was finally heading in the right direction.